Imagine standing in a room where the air feels like a perfect spring morning, despite the fact that, outside, the world is locked in the bone-chilling grip of a Pennsylvania winter. It is January. The thermometer on the porch reads 41 degrees. There is no humming furnace, no glowing space heater, and no ductwork snaking through the ceiling. Yet inside these four walls, the air sits at a steady, comfortable 71 degrees. This isn't the result of a high-tech solar array, an expensive heat pump, or a secret geothermal vent. This is a house that costs less than a high-end smartphone to build a structure, with no moving parts, no mechanical heart, and a materials list that would strike a modern contractor as a practical joke. For over 2 centuries, communities in places like Lancaster County and Holmes County have lived within this physical impossibility. They have relied on a building philosophy that doesn't fight the climate, but swallows it whole. In the peak of August, when the Ohio humidity pushes the mercury to a blistering 102 degrees, these interiors remain a tomb like 74. If you were to walk into one of these homes for the first time, your immediate instinct would be to search for the thermostat. You would hunt for the air conditioner or the hidden fans, but you would find nothing but stillness. When you press your palm against the wall, you don't feel the cold plastic of drywall or the hollow echo of a standard frame house. Instead, you feel a deep, radiating warm sauce stored energy that feels more like the ancient heartbeat of the earth than a product of modern industry. Engineers call this phenomenon thermal lag, but to the person standing inside, it feels like cheating the laws of physics. It is the art of using time itself as a building material. We have been conditioned to believe that shelter is something we must buy from a grid, something that requires a monthly subscription to a utility company just to survive the seasons. We've been told that comfort is a mechanical achievement, something forced upon a room by machines. But these walls, thick, dense, and composed of nothing more than the ground beneath our feet, prove otherwise. They represent a forgotten wisdom that has been quietly maintained on the fringes of society, far from the eyes of corporate developers and city planners. However, there is a reason you don't see these houses on every street corner. In 48 states, building a home this efficient and this affordable is essentially a legal nightmare. The system has been designed to make the most sustainable material on the planet the most difficult to use. But the barriers are not as absolute as they seem. Deep in the heart of the Chihuahuan Desert, one woman has exploited a silent legal loophole to construct 600 of these homes, bypassing every permit office and regulatory gatekeeper in her path. By the time we're finished, you'll understand how she did it, why the industry wants to stop you from doing the same, and exactly how the dirt in your own backyard might be the most valuable asset you own. To understand the magic of an earth-walled home, one must look past the humble appearance of the brick and peer into the molecular structure of the ground itself. The recipe for this architectural alchemy is deceptively simple: roughly 70 to 80% clay, 15 to 25% sand, and a small addition of chopped straw or organic fiber. You mix these elements with water until they reach a consistency that can hold a shape, press them into a wooden mold, and let the sun do the work. There are no high-temperature kilns, no massive industrial factories, and no complex supply chains. In fact, the energy required to create a single sun-dried Adobe brick is roughly 2,000 British thermal units. Compare that to the 30,000 units required for a standard fired brick, and you begin to see a 15-to-1 efficiency ratio before the house is even built. But the real power of this material lies in its relationship with time. Modern construction relies on insulation fluffy materials, designed to slow the movement of heat traded by something called an R value. Adobe operates on a completely different principle, known as thermal mass. While standard wood frame houses try to block the heat, an earth wall manages it. Think of a 20-inch thick clay wall as a massive thermal battery. When the punishing afternoon sun strikes the exterior, the heat doesn't just pass through. It begins a slow, microscopic migration through the dense packed earth. This journey takes between 8 and 12 hours. This means that the peak heat of 2 in the afternoon doesn't reach the interior of the home until 10 or 11 at night, just as the outside air begins to turn cold. The wall then releases its stored warmth into the living space exactly when it is needed most. By morning, the process reverses. The cool night air begins its own slow journey inward, arriving at the interior surface just as the afternoon heat peaks outside. This isn't just theory. It is a proven scientific reality that the modern building industry has largely ignored. In 2018, the University of Arizona conducted a rigorous 10-month study, building 2 identical structures side by side on Adobe and 1 standard wood frame. In the harsh desert environment where temperatures swung from 48 to over 100 degrees, the results were staggering. The Adobe structure maintained a remarkably stable interior average of 76 degrees, with 40% less temperature variance than its wooden counterpart. Most importantly, the wood frame house required mechanical cooling for every single month of the study, while the Adobe house required none. Beyond the temperature, there is the issue of health. Modern houses are built with cavities, hollow spaces between layers of material, where moisture often becomes trapped. The EPA estimates that nearly half of all American homes suffer from mold issues because these breathing spaces were never actually designed to breathe. Adobe, however, is a solid mass. It is a vapor-permeable material that allows moisture to move through it without condensing. It doesn't rot, it doesn't harbor spores, and it doesn't require a warranty. It is a structural-grade material that often exceeds the strength requirements of the International Residential Code, using nothing more than the raw dirt under your feet. It is the ultimate paradox of the modern age. The most advanced building material we have ever discovered is the one we have used for 10,000 years. If you have a material that is virtually free, fireproof, and naturally climate-controlled, you have to ask a difficult question: why did we stop using it? The answer isn't found in a laboratory or on a construction site, but in the dry, bureaucratic archives of the early 20th century. The transition away from the earth wasn't fueled by a superior invention. It was engineered through a silent war of paperwork. The first major blow was struck in 1927, when the Pacific Coast Building Officials Conference published the first Uniform Building Code. This document was the blueprint for the modern American suburb, and it was written with a very specific vision of Progresso built entirely of wood, concrete, and steel. Adobe was not banned in this document. Instead, it was simply omitted. In the world of building law, an omission is often more powerful than a prohibition. Because the code didn't mention earth as a standard material, any citizen wishing to build with it was forced into a process called alternate method approval. This required hiring specialized structural engineers and consultants to prove that a 10,000-year-old technology was safe for a simple 3-bedroom house. For a home where the raw materials cost only $300, the engineering fees and administrative hurdles alone could spiral between $5,000 and $25,000. The code didn't need to make Adobe illegal. It simply buried it under a 100-to-1 regulatory overhead ratio, ensuring it would never be a viable option for the common man. The killing blow, however, arrived in 1949. This was the year the Federal Housing Administration, or the FHA, issued its minimum property standards for mortgage eligibility. Deep within these regulations was a clause that changed the American landscape forever. It mandated that for a home to be eligible for a government-backed mortgage, it had to use conventional framing with dimension lumber. In a single stroke of an administrative pen, earth-walled homes were rendered unfinanceable. Without a mortgage, the average middle-class American family could not afford to build, regardless of how cheap the materials were. Without insurance, which was tethered to these same rigid standards, no bank would issue a loan on a property made of clay. There was no public debate on this monumental shift. There was no congressional vote or public hearing for the citizens to voice their concerns. This wasn't a choice made by the people. It was a series of administrative rulings drafted in backrooms between government officials and the burgeoning housing industry. They didn't need to win a scientific argument about which material was better for the environment or the occupants' long-term health. They only needed to control the legal definition of what a real house was allowed to be. By the time the dust settled, the ancient right of a person to build their own shelter from the ground beneath their feet had been erased from the American mainstream. A system had been built where the only way to have a roof over your head was to enter into a lifetime of debt to purchase the products of the very industry that wrote the rules. By 1970, the pressure from environmentalists and traditional builders became too loud for the regulatory bodies to ignore. On the surface, it appeared that the movement had won a historic victory when the Uniform Building Code finally added an explicit chapter dedicated to Adobe construction. But those who understood the physics of the earth knew immediately that this was not an olive branch. It was a Trojan horse. This new chapter wasn't written to facilitate natural building. It was engineered to dismantle the very advantages that made earth construction superior. The industry didn't ban the material this time, they simply poisoned it with modern requirements. The code began to mandate that Adobe walls be reinforced with steel rebar every 24 inches, both vertically and horizontally. It required the addition of Portland cement stabilization and massive concrete bond beams at every floor level. To the uninitiated, these sounded like sensible safety upgrades for a modern era. In reality, they were a structural and thermal death sentence. When you drive steel through a thick clay wall, you aren't just adding strength, you are creating a thermal highway. While the clay is trying to store heat and release it slowly over 12 hours, the steel rebar acts as a conductor, allowing the outside temperature to bypass the thermal mass entirely and penetrate the interior in minutes. This phenomenon, known as thermal bridging, effectively turned a high-performance ancient technology into a mediocre modern one. It destroyed the thermal lag that makes the house work, forcing the occupant back into the arms of the air conditioning industry. The financial fingerprints on these regulations were impossible to ignore. The drafting of this chapter was heavily influenced by the Portland Cement Associazione, powerful trade body representing industrial titans like Lafarge, Holcim, and Vulcan Materials. These are corporations that see the raw, unrefined earth beneath your feet as a direct threat to their $18 billion annual revenue. Every bag of cement and every foot of rebar mandated by the code was a direct transfer of wealth from the independent builder to the industrial complex. By forcing these upgrades, the industry ensured that an Adobe home would not only perform worse than its ancient predecessors, but would also cost significantly more than a standard wood frame house. This is the psychological brilliance of modern regulation. It uses the language of consumer protection to safeguard the producer's profit. The National Association of Home Builders has consistently opposed natural building pathways, citing safety concerns that decades of performance data have proven to be non-existent. Their true concern is far more practical and far more cynical. A family that can build their own shelter using their own labor and local soil is a family that doesn't need to hire an NAHB member, sign a 30-year mortgage, or purchase synthetic materials. The 1970 code didn't just add rebar, it added a permanent layer of dependency. It ensured that even if you chose to return to the earth, you would still have to pay a steep toll to the very industries that spent 40 years trying to make your traditions illegal. While the American landscape was being paved over by industrial mandates, a lone figure in Egypt was fighting a parallel battle that would eventually expose the global scale of this architectural suppression. His name was Hassan Fathi, a 1926 graduate of Cairo University School of Engineering. For 50 years, Fathi didn't just build houses. He conducted a lifelong experiment in human dignity. He recognized a fundamental truth that the modern world had chosen to forget, that poverty is often not a lack of resources, but a lack of access to the ground we walk on. In 1945, the Egyptian government handed him what seemed like the opportunity of a lifetime, the design of a resettlement village near the legendary Valley of the Kings. Fathi's vision for this project, known as New Gorna, was a direct challenge to the industrial status quo. He didn't want to import expensive steel or concrete from distant factories. Instead, he reached back into the deep history of the Nile, resurrecting traditional Nubian techniques like the barrel-vaulted ceiling. These weren't just aesthetic choices. They were structural masterclasses that allowed for grand, spanning roofs without the need for a single piece of timber or a single reinforced beam. He envisioned 540 homes for 7,000 residents, all constructed from the very clay of the building site. The labor was local, the materials were free, and the resulting homes were masterpieces of natural cooling, maintaining a serene interior temperature while the desert sun hammered the exterior. The cost to the families moving into these homes was zero. And that is exactly where the project signed its own death warrant. In the eyes of the construction establishment, a house that costs nothing to build is a house that generates no profit, no interest, and no dependency. The contractors who held the existing government housing contracts saw Fathy's success not as a humanitarian breakthrough, but as an existential threat to their business model. They didn't argue that his houses were unsafe. They couldn't, as the structures were beautiful and robust. Instead, they did what modern lobbyists have perfected. They moved the battle into the halls of the housing ministry. Through direct political pressure and bureaucratic maneuvering, they succeeded in having the project terminated, after only 150 homes were finished. Fathy detailed this systemic sabotage in his 1973 seminal work, Architecture for the Poor. He spent the rest of his career as an outcast, building on the fringes of an industry that refused to acknowledge his genius. When he died in 1989, the Smithsonian named his book one of the 20 most important architectural works of the century. Yet, the official construction establishment didn't even send a representative to his funeral, but the true verdict was rendered by time itself. Today, more than 76 years later, the 150 Adobe homes Fathy built are still standing, their thick walls as sturdy as the day they were dried. Meanwhile, the modern concrete structures built nearby at the same time have largely crumbled into dust or been demolished. Fathy proved that the earth doesn't just provide shelter, it provides a legacy that industry cannot duplicate and bureaucracy cannot kill. In 2008, a student of Hassan Fathis named Simone Swan arrived at the dusty borderlands of Texas and Mexico with a radical conviction. She looked at the families of Presidio County people earning between $8,000 and $12,000 a year and realized they were being choked by a system that demanded they buy a lifestyle they could never afford. They were priced out of every conventional mortgage and every government program, but Swan knew they didn't need a lender or a subsidized apartment. They needed a shovel and the courage to look at the ground beneath their feet. She brought with her the same method that built the ancient city of Jericho 10,000 years ago, adapted specifically for the harsh demands of the Chihuahuan desert. The process she refined is a masterclass in self-reliance. You survey the site, and if the clay content is right, which, in this region, it almost always is, you dig. You mix that clay with sand and chop straw in ratios. Swan spent 15 years calibrating in the field. You add water, press the mixture into wooden forms, and let the relentless Texas sun do the curing. 2 weeks later, you have a structural unit more durable than anything found in a big box hardware store. A team of 4 or 5 people, usually the very family who will live in the finished house, can stack these bricks into 18-inch walls bonded with simple mud mortar. There is no rebar. There is no Portland cement. From the first shovel in the ground to the moment the family moves in, the timeline is just 6 weeks. The total material cost, between $800 and $1,500. The monthly energy bill, $0. Swan has repeated this miracle 600 times. 600 families now own their homes outright, free from the cycle of debt and the volatility of global supply chains that can fail or price them out at any moment. Texas building authorities have attempted to shut her down, citing her operation for code violations 3 times. But Swan didn't stop, because she wasn't actually violating the law. She was building in the space where the law doesn't reach. She utilized a vital legal provision known as the owner-builder exemption. In states like Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, an individual is allowed to construct their own primary residence without meeting the full suffocating standards of the International Residential Code. You don't need a contractor's license, a permit office approval, or a bank's permission. You simply dig, stack, and move in. This loophole is the ultimate threat to the industrial complex. It proves that the only thing standing between a family and a debt-free, high-performance home is a building code written by the people who want to sell you what you don't need. If this reality sparks something in you, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments, what would actually stop you from building this way? Not what the code says. What would personally stop you? Because this channel is going to spend the next year helping you dismantle those barriers, one video at a time. Subscribe now, because we're about to take this story 20 feet higher. The American roofing industry is worth $42 billion a year. And the story of how they've suppressed ancient living solutions is even darker than the one we've just uncovered.